Thanks for joining us for the Secure Connections podcast, brought to you by IoTSSA, the Internet of Things Security Services Association. I'm your host, Brian Sherman, Content Director for IoTSSA, and joining me today to share his insight on IT security and compliance concerns in the financial industry is Brad Deflin. He's a noted cybersecurity expert and founder and president of Total Digital Security. Brad has more than 25 years experience in operations, sales, audit, compliance, and supervision of rigorously regulated financial environments, including a few companies you may recognize: Merrill Lynch, Lehman Brothers, Wells Fargo, and JP Morgan. Our guest is also an author and frequent speaker on the matters of online risk, cybercrime, and the emerging technology that defends and protects from what has become our most critical personal and professional risks today. Brad, welcome to the Secure Connections podcast.
Brian, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, hopefully I'm looking forward to a great conversation today and to learn a little more, especially about the financial industry and those risks. But you have an impressive resume when it comes to cybersecurity and the financial industry. When did you decide to get into IT?
Well, my orientation to technology began very early in the 80s with some of the first personal computers when I adopted them into my business and personal environment. And so my understanding of all things digital, all the way down to the physics of an electron, started early. But it really began to take off in 2012 when it became apparent that cyber risk was migrating outside of the IT department's domain, and that I had a certain purview and skill set that might be helpful. So I would call 2012 and then early 2013 as sort of the early years in this endeavor here.
Very good. So you saw the trend as far as, we all kind of, I should speak for everybody, but, computers have been around for a while. We've gotten used to the tech side, but moving more, outside of that network environment has been more of a recent development. I guess 2011, 2012 seems so far along, but it really hasn't been in the sphere of things.
Exactly. The cybersecurity industry, 25, 30 years old, along those lines, was really about antivirus and then large enterprise, military, government protection. It wasn't so much around users and personal devices. And I noted that began to change in around 2012. And I saw what I thought were some very bankable trends around these things. And that's what encouraged me to make the pivot, more or less, from investment banking, financial services into cybersecurity. I don't see that as a big pivot career-wise. I thought it was very consistent, but that's when I really began my focus on cybersecurity.
So was that the motivating force behind building Total Digital Shield?
Total Digital Security was built. The motivating force, Brian, was really around two, what I call bankable trends, two trends that you could take to the bank, very predictable and long-term and really paradigm shifting, if you will. The one bankable trend was what I would call the personalization of the risk, or the democratization of the risk, where cybersecurity was beginning to show up even more out in the field on personal users and their personal devices than it was in the enterprise domain managed environment. It was 2013 when there were more breaches reported as a result of cybercrime for profit, as opposed to hacktivism or cyber warfare or IP theft, some of the more institutional motivations that had been around for decades. Suddenly in 2013, over half the breaches were around cybercrime for profit. That has now reached a 90+% level. The pie, of course, is much bigger, and IP theft and cyber warfare and espionage are still really big deals, but it's cybercrime for profit that is the overwhelming motivation in cybercrime today. So the bankable trend, number one, was the personalization of the risk. The bankable trend, number two, was sort of the flip side, if you will, and that was, in 2012, the world was in a tough spot. It was still reeling from the financial collapse of 2008, probably bottomed in 2012, but there really were not any growth industries noted on the planet. It was very stagnant. And yet there was a lot of capital as a result of Fed-induced lower interest rates and balance sheet management. And so we started to see a lot of fresh capital come into the industry, as cybersecurity was noted as being a strong growth industry for the globe for the coming years. So the two bankable trends on one hand are the personalization of the risk. On the other hand was new innovation coming from the industry that was really focusing on users and devices and increasing efficacy and ease of use of those solutions all the way out in the field. And so total digital security sits in between, if you will, those two bankable trends. On one hand, the new holders of the risk, individuals, small businesses, families, high net worth individuals, really everybody, anybody that has a device that connects to the internet is now a holder of that risk. And the other side of the equation, introducing this innovation that was coming from the industry to solve for that risk. So we don't invent anything when it comes to IT security. We act as a platform that introduces best-in-class, really business-to-business type solutions into environments that can go all the way down to one person on one device and solve for the risk that way.
Very good. Makes perfect sense. So first of all, I think I rebranded your company for you earlier on, but it is Total Digital Security, so I apologize for that. But
not at all.
The one thing you mentioned was the personalization of the risk. And I know you and I had talked previously about your approaches to secure, are a little different than other security firms, as you're focused on the home and business side of the equation. Can you kind of explain, you touched on it a little bit, but explain why you went that route. Why is that so important to hit the users, everywhere that they're touching a computer?
Yeah, so really that's the crux of what we're all about, Brian. I would say this risk is now existential, right? It doesn't go away when we punch out and leave the enterprise environment, certainly. It is 24/7. It is professional and personal. It's at home, in the office, on the road. It's everywhere. It's existential. And the solutions had historically been around protecting a fixed environment and protecting people and users while they were in that environment. And the personalization of the risk now is pushing that risk all the way to the last capillaries, I would say, of the internet, the last user and the last device. And what we noted in 2012, 2013 is nobody was ready. In fact, nobody even cared, frankly. So I think that the topic is still abstract for a lot of people. There was then, and there still is, a lot of apathy and kind of avoidance behavior. And back then there was a sense that this risk was not relevant to individuals using their personal devices anywhere, anytime, that it was more relevant to the Targets or the Home Depots or the large institutions. Today, I would tell you that there is a much higher sense of relevance, a personal understanding or a personal internalization of the sense of the relevance of the risk, because a neighbor may have been hacked, a family member may have been hacked, an associate. It's becoming much better understood that this is a risk that's very relevant to our all-day, everyday life. But yes, what encouraged us to get in the business was the fact that it was a major, major trend. Nobody was ready, and yet the technology was taking care of itself in terms of creating solutions. We had to help people find those solutions, be comfortable with those solutions, and use those solutions as part of their everyday lives, almost a new life skill, if you will, for all things digital in today's age.
Makes perfect sense now. Now, you being that you're so interactive between the business and personal side, I just have to ask is how many companies do you find that still allow their employees to create their own passwords, or the employees are using those passwords in all of their home applications too?
I'll tell you, Brian, it's almost everyone.
Yeah.
The exception is somebody that is using an administrated password manager, is advocating or enforcing two-factor authentication, is thinking about the people or the human element of the problem. From a business standpoint, there is still a very low level of adaptation. We are finding on the personal and home level, it's interesting, people are actually make decisions faster to secure themselves. And I think it's because from the home and personal level, people don't want to lose anything. And so they may be looking at their retirement accounts, their investment accounts, their online banking accounts, and they're realizing that without paying, a couple of bucks for protection, a lot of that today is at risk. And so we're finding they'll make decisions quickly, they'll onboard solutions quickly, and they'll show an energized sense of willingness to adapt into the new, what I call the new face of risk. On the business side, I think that so many business owners and managers are, overwhelmed with the day-to-day operation. They're looking to be competitive out there. And at the end of the day, they're pretty much done for the day and are ready to call it a day and come back again tomorrow, versus instituting changes and dealing with helping people manage change that might not, in their view, be immediately productive to the bottom line. And so we're seeing those subsets and those differences between those subsets from an individual standpoint and a business standpoint, which is really interesting to us. More businesses that we talk to end up coming to, we try to get in front of them preemptively, but then end up coming to us after the fact happened. Oh, you were right. We should have done it. I know we should have done it. Let's do it. So they've been breached and they don't want that to happen again. Whereas when we're dealing with individuals and families about being preemptive, they don't want that to happen. They don't want to go through that loss. They may have retirement in view in some years and don't want to lose those funds and have to make up for it. So they seem to be much more willing to take action and put the solutions to work, even in businesses, which I think is an interesting observation these days.
So it kind of highlights the disconnect sometimes too. Is, I mean, at home you have skin in the game. It's very personal, but it's your personal responsibility. But at work, how many employees and even leaders, and I won't say owners, but those that may not have the ultimate responsibility think that's somebody else's responsibility to handle security, and that's, we need to take them from that personal side, like you were talking about, and get in them to have more skin in the game at work.
Yeah, there it is, Brian. You just, I think you just put it all together. You have to engage the human element. You have to think about the individuals, and sometimes you need to bring them out of their productive spot in the workplace to bring them current and to bring them to a place where they're more aware and more engaged in the solutions, and that they internalize the risk and feel somewhat accountable for that risk to really begin to change and adapt. So I think you hit the nail right on the head there.
Great. Well, that's with a lot of help from you, but it just makes sense, the transition we're seeing today. But let's talk about kind of what our goal, I think my goal was today too, to dig into what are some of the biggest pain points in for financial organizations when it comes to cybersecurity.
So it's really interesting what's happening in financial organizations. We deal with a lot of banks, commercial banks, lenders, investment banks, family offices. So everything from a very institutional level to a very personal level, and everything in between from the financial services industry. And what we're seeing is the banks have deployed tremendous resources, a lot of money to protect their infrastructure, to protect their brand, to protect their clients and their clients' information. And they've done a tremendous job, I think, of hardening their environments and really mitigating this risk from their standpoint. Where there's a much more frustration from the banks is getting their customers to do something. And again, I'll go back to the business customer. They're finding it very challenging to convince the business customer that it is a worthwhile effort to be preemptive and to take some measures that can avoid and mitigate this risk. The businesses are still looking to the banks to solve everything and to reach into their pockets if anything goes wrong. But that liability and the ability for the banks to come forward and say, okay, this wire transfer was entirely your fault, and you didn't follow any of the procedures, and you have not had any anti-phishing education, and you want us, to reimburse you for those lost funds. It's just not happening anymore. So businesses are surprised when they find themselves in that position, but still are still resisting, frankly, taking those preemptive measures, even with a lot of encouragement coming from the banks.
So what are I guess some of the other preemptive measures that they could be doing? Are you seeing security awareness education and things like that being implemented, or is there's still a lot of resistance against that?
There is. People feel you're going to take my employees out of their productive spot, and we don't have time for that, and they're not interested in that, and they just want to do their job and go home and that sort of thing. So yes, a lot of resistance, but we approach really every business level case anyway with addressing the human element. We can install all the cybersecurity technology in the world, but if you don't have engaged, aware employees that can think critically on their own 2 feet, that is your major element of risk today. Humans are being hacked more than technology is being hacked. So we start with the human factor. We start with discussing the individuals. And the fact is that we need to help individuals as leaders, right? And as people that are responsible for making these decisions to help those around us to think critically, to be more aware. And we think a great place to start doing that is a workshop type environment over a lunch and learn, is to simply talk about some of the fundamentals of digital risk, like why is this happening? Why is it so different? Very few people understand the nature of digital versus the nature of everything else we ever experienced through humankind. And then follow up that workshop after engaging with the employees, after stimulating their awareness and their interest. And we do it in a way that is not so much compliance or finger wagging. It is more, we're here to help you, not just in your professional life, but in your personal life also. What you're going to learn today will apply to everything you do in life, whether you're here at work or any other place, for the balance of your lives. And we, I think, present it in a way where people then open up and internalize these issues. And that's what really in turn drives ROI, the return on investment for these programs, to the enterprise. Because when individuals internalize this and understand the personal risk they have, they begin to think differently as employees. And that's a benefit, again, to the business. Then we follow that workshop up with phishing simulations. We use best-in-class third-party developers that know this social engineering science and know exactly what's going on in the field and are doing, I think, a really good job at simulating those types of phishing campaigns into the work environment, onto each individual desktop or laptop, so that they can actually experience what's going out there and have a chance to learn from their mistakes. And with the administrative control panels, with these anti-phishing simulation programs, you can spot, well, which employees might need more coaching, right? What offices, what branches are not up to speed? And how can we help them? And how can we stress that they are accountable for learning and adjusting and adapting in order to get to a better spot? So industry-wide, the statistics look something like this. When this phishing simulation first comes into a workplace environment, about 27% of the employees fail. In the first month, the phishing simulated emails that go out, they're clicking bad links, they're responding to bad emails, they're doing what you don't want them to do in the event of a social engineered phishing business email compromise type exploit. After 1 year of knowing they're accountable, of knowing they're being tested, and after 1 year of helping them and coaching them to understand better, that rate falls to just over 2%. So in less than 1 year, in a very affordable way, you can make significant a significant difference in terms of the culture and in terms of that human factor when it comes to the risk. And then the security technology is enabled and empowered by users that, again, are another line of defense, another firewall, if you will, a human firewall, as some say, to add levels of protection from all of these highly engineered exploits that we're being barraged with every single day in the business environment.
Makes perfect sense. And I know in the financial industry, as you had mentioned before, cyber criminals are out to make money today. And if there's a place where you can get closer to the money, it's targeting those that are in the financial industry or the customers of those in the financial industry, as we've seen from some of the phishing attacks. Citibank is probably and not to disparage them, but they're the ones that I've seen most often where you're getting the spoofing emails coming in. So It seems like they are very big targets and need to even take additional steps, whether you're a large organization like that or even a small credit union. It would be so easy to be spoofed and to be alert to the fact that their customers may be duped into these things in their accounts. What active role do they take in making sure their customers are not falling for these type of things? Do most financial organizations have a lot of feelers out to be paying attention to make sure they're not getting some false phishing schemes coming from them?
Yeah, they're starting to, but to your point, the industry, the financial services industry, says that in 2017, so call it a year ago, more or less, it was the first time that more bank accounts, more investment accounts were breached as a result of credentials being stolen off customer computers, typically in their home, as opposed to being stolen from the bank's computers. So where the risk is taking place and where the exploits are happening are outside the bank's control. However, they're still a stakeholder, right? They're still a stakeholder in the consequences from a brand, from a reputation, from an administration, from a workload standpoint, as their business customers and their personal customers are coming to them saying, why didn't you protect me? You have to make up for this loss, and finding that they're not in a good spot. So we are seeing recently, it hasn't been that long, where banks are beginning to make investments in creating programs, whether it be a luncheon, a client event, a webinar, various ways to bring the topic to bear, to help educate and inform their customers and to encourage their customers to find solutions, both on the human level and the technology level, for their own environments. And so we're getting involved with a lot of those programs. We're finding the interest level, even over the last 6 months, on behalf of the audience, is much, much higher. This was not something people would cut out a piece of their day to attend a year ago necessarily. Now people are going more out of their way to adjust schedules and to make it an important element of their day-to-day activities to understand, to learn, and to accept the invitations of these financial institutions to attend a luncheon or a client event or a webinar to help with their own understanding of what's happening and to find some answers that are out there for them.
Makes sense. So to your point is financial institutions have to be probably more proactive than any, because they're protecting their own reputation, especially with clients. A lot of times people are looking to push responsibility to others, even when we know it's their fault. So it sounds like a good opportunity for skilled cybersecurity professionals to provide that type of consultation and services.
I think so. And what we're seeing is, like, even in lending departments and treasury departments, they are being tasked with such a workload to respond to customer breaches that they're spending more time responding to those customer breaches as opposed to finding more people to lend money to or finding more customers to use their treasury services. So it's very counterproductive from their standpoint. So I think that, everybody has an interest in driving the issue forward and bringing the solutions that are out there to bear. And I think the banks and the financial services companies are finally deploying more resources in that regard. And they're doing it both internally and externally. The large banks, the large financial services companies, and even the smaller ones, they have vast IT departments. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the human element, the adaptation, all the way down to the last individual. And that's not necessarily the IT department's job. It's more HR, it's more governance, it's more of a cultural challenge. And so they're rethinking, I think, how to approach this and how to be effective for all the right reasons. From a brand, profitability, productivity, everything is being affected by this issue.
Makes sense. Now protecting clients, protecting banks and financial institutions is crucial, but the priority is keeping everybody safe and their account information secure and their money there. But what about the other side of things for financial institutions, which is compliance?
Right.
What type of requirements are they most concerned about?
Well, I think everybody has an eye on GDPR, what took place in Eurozone last year with tremendous regulation around personal information. Some would say personal information is the most valuable commodity on the planet. It doesn't matter whether it's financial, healthcare, or anything else. It's just personal information and more details and items around personal information. So I think they feel regulatory creep, potential liability creep. I think that there are plenty of legal elements that are determining, how do we find liability and how do we mine that? I'll use the real estate industry as an example that really has a challenge. Unlike financial services, where you have employees that are employed full-time, subject to certain regulatory requirements, a compliance office down the hall, and the leverage of HR. In real estate, you have independent contractors. In many cases, they're using their own, Gmail or Yahoo or AOL email account. There's not a whole lot of training, nor compliance or regulatory pressure. And so it's kind of like herding cats. And yet these individual agents are handling on their personal devices over their unsecured email accounts and unsecured environments, very important sensitive information around wire transfers and closing dates and title information. And it's all hubbing through the agent without any protection at all. And so that element impacts almost that sort of uncontrolled, unmanaged element impacts so much of what happens outside of the things that we can manage as a bank or as a financial services company, that the perspective has to be much more broad, I think, today to manage effectively. And, you said it earlier, and I think it really stands true, where it was always somebody else's problem. It was the IT department's problem. It was, and even in the C-suite, even the CEO, the COO, the CFO, in so many cases, it's the IT department's problem. And they have not felt compelled to really understand the nature of the risk or what is going to be required from a broad cultural standpoint to drive really effective change. And they still have problems thinking about it. And I'll tell you that I ask the question with every audience I have, and our audiences are from the boardroom to the break room to the living room and everything in between. And on average, when I ask who can tell me what Moore's Law is about, or who can explain to me the network effect, less than 5% can raise their hand and articulate what these number one drivers of change today are all about. And I think that without fundamental understandings of the digital world and why it is so different, it is very hard for anybody to internalize and appreciate and think more broadly about how to drive change. And I think that's where a lot of people are. So I think, we can't walk into a room, wag our finger and say, you got to start, using real passwords and don't write them down. That's just not effective. We have to take a step back and say, let's talk about digital, why it's so different, why nobody's prepared, why it's only going to get worse before it gets better. And let's start with these primary drivers: Moore's Law, the law of the network, the mobile revolution. And that really sets the stage for greater understanding of the individual pieces. These are pieces that are hard to understand if you don't understand the whole, and the whole is hard to understand if you don't understand the individual pieces. And so you've got to be patient enough and have enough desire to at least learn those fundamentals or have a sense for those fundamentals, because when you do, you have a certain context and framework in your head that helps you think about the issues much more broadly, much more effectively, and talk to the IT department and not feel that it is purely somebody else's responsibility and that they're going to cover the base even if you don't understand it. And that's still something that we see a lot out there that would surprise you, I think.
Yeah, it makes sense. Even from the MSP perspective, I'll give you an example. Last week was our IoTSSA Cybersecurity Expo in Jacksonville, Florida. And I think it's 4 months ago, we were in New Jersey. And the difference between asking the question about how many clients fall under GDPR in New York City area, it was pretty much I think there may have been 2 that didn't raise their hands as far as GDPR. In Jacksonville, there were only 2 of a similar size group that did raise their hand. And I think a lot of it comes down to 2 is when you uncover, oh, by the way, you do have clients who have one client in the UK, for example, which would make them fall under that. But taking a step further back, a lot of the experts that are there, including some of the master MSPs, even go down to the point of it really doesn't matter the compliance. You need to know that for your customer. But if you're implementing all the best practices across the board, the standards for whatever channel company should be offering to their client, you're going to cover 90+% of their compliance requirements just by doing the right things.
Right, exactly.
Getting them to pay for it's a different story. So you have to have those discussions of which things actually do apply to them. But yeah, it's a challenge because the checkbook at the end of the day does come down to it. Financial, I know they have somewhat deeper pockets, but you still have to be cost effective when it comes to supporting their cybersecurity.
Very true. And to that point, in our experience out there in the field, so our natural market when we first started was ultra high net worth individuals and families. They were starting to be targeted in 2012, 2013. Of course, that pace has increased and has gone down the food chain. Hackers can now hack in volume. So if they can get $300 at a time across 1,000 people or something greater, they're doing it. But the ultra high net worth class understands risk. They understand economic value and they understand risk and reward. And I think that they were first to really appreciate the economic value to cybersecurity from a risk reward standpoint. And when you do think that through that way and you do a little math in your head, I don't think there is greater economic value out there in 2019 than incorporating some modern technology and solutions and human factor elements to mitigate this risk.
Excellent.
And so sometimes presenting it that way can be eye-opening, but you are right. I think especially in the business environment, it is more challenging when they might be thinking about a quarter-to-quarter P&L.
Very good. Great advice, Brad. What advice do you have for MSPs looking to take on maybe their first financial client, whether it be a credit union or a regional bank? I know there's those that are looking to up their game and get into the industry, but what type of roadblocks are there, and what's the best route of action?
Well, so, the best route, the most effective route, I don't know if they're the same, but generally I would say you can't ignore the people, right? If you're talking to a credit union, if you're talking to a financial services company, I would really encourage including an element around employees and cultural adaptation, because, I'm convinced you cannot have just a highly aware, engaged, critical thinking individual And you can't just have great cybersecurity technology. You really do need both. And so to align both of those in your value proposition and in your approach to drive serious change within your new client environment, I highly encourage making sure you do not forget about that human element piece. And that's challenging for some IT folks because that might not be where they come from, but there are good partners out there. And I would say that to really deliver value and to deliver something that lasts and is meaningful, and to put your client in a position where they look back in a year, 2 years, 5 years, and say, did we deploy resources well? Did we make a good decision working with that MSP? That their answer is a resounding yes. You've got to include the human element today.
Makes perfect sense. So what's the best way for our listeners to contact you in case they have questions or would like to extend this conversation, Brad?
So my last name is unusual, Deflin, Deflin. You can Google me, and I'm all about cybersecurity, and I publish a lot of original content. I do a lot of presentations. Very easy to find me on the internet, on LinkedIn. My company is Total Digital Security. Our experience is from the field, right from that intersection of people, the technology they use every day, and this new face of risk, digital risk. So I think we certainly have a lot of data. We have experiential knowledge and strategic insights that I think are really unique. 6 years of 24/7 doing this. And we've, I think, seen just about all of it. And we can bring, I think, some real insights to bear to be helpful. So I would be happy to receive any incoming inquiries along those lines, Brian.
Very good. So before we close, is there any final thoughts on cybersecurity, the financial industry, or anything else you'd like to leave our audience with?
Yes, thank you. I would say this, honestly, I think cybersecurity is almost a sideshow into something much, much greater. And what's much greater is our transition, that is humankind's transition to the digital age. Humankind has transitioned from Stone Age to Bronze Age, or from the age of agriculture to the age of industry. We are in the first innings of our humanity-wide transition into the digital age. And the first innings are where people are not ready and have not adapted and are low-hanging fruit. And we will see, again, a bankable trend that this will continue until it finally is more relevant, or perceived as more relevant much more broadly, that there are probably some federal government incentives around adaptation. And that really, as James Clapper said before he left office in 2016, the number one risk to our country, it's not nuclear, it's not terrorism, it's cyber. And it's not in cyber Armageddon, which is a big risk, and I think will happen, like the Russians take down our electric utility grid, or God forbid, the North Koreans take down air traffic control, or whatever, cyber Armageddon. But as James Clapper said, it is in the aggregate, the low to moderate damage, that's size damage that's being done. You don't read it in the headlines. A lot of it isn't reported, but it is the number one risk, according to James Clapper, to economic stability and national security. So I think that's a pretty high calling, and we should motivate and energize ourselves around that calling. And that was capped in, I think it was April of 17, when Warren Buffett was speaking to shareholders in Omaha, as he does every year. And happy shareholders, 30,000 of them, 40,000 of them, show up in Omaha to hear from the Oracle of Omaha and to thank him for doing such a great job in managing their investments. And invariably, somebody says, Warren, where's the risk? Is it earnings? Is it interest rates? Is it the federal deficit? They're looking for answers in terms of where's their risk. And he said without hesitation, with Bill Gates at his side, the number one risk to all of mankind is cyber. So again, those would be my parting words. This is a very high calling. This isn't just about, preventing phishing. This is really about helping all of us, whether it be individuals, families, communities, companies, businesses, everything in between, to adapt and learn to survive and succeed in this new digital age. And for now, that begins with cybersecurity.
Excellent advice, Brad. With our time running out, I'd like to thank Brad Deflin. And I always think DEF CON, Brad. So DEF CON, but with a lid at the end. So perfect for the security industry. But I'd like to thank Brad Deflin from Total Digital Security for sharing his expertise with us today. We appreciate all of you who tuned in to listen to our conversation on cybersecurity in the financial industry. I encourage you to take a minute and check out the list of upcoming IoTSSA Cybersecurity Expo one-day events on the association's website. That's IoTSSA.com. Again, thank you for joining us. We hope you have a profitable and highly secure day.